Have you ever unwrapped a present? Maybe the person who gave you the present is in the room with you, maybe not. And as soon as you get the wrapping paper off, you see right away, oh, wow, this is some kind of really impressive artistic box. It could be carved out of wood, could be made out of metal, whatever it is. And then your mind starts racing. You're looking at this beautiful box that was underneath the wrapping paper, and you wonder what could be inside. You know, it may be a handmade box, it may be produced in a factory, but there's this highly decorative box. And, most packages, you get a hint at, what's going to be inside once you take the lid off. And then you take the lid off the box, and there's nothing inside because the present is the box. Now, if the person who gave it to you is sitting right there with you, on Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate, they might say, oh, yeah, it's a decorative box. So I gave it to you. You can, can keep your socks in it, keep anything you want in it. Right, the present is the box. You're not necessarily disappointed. You're not mad at the person or something. It's just this moment of being slightly out of step with expectations. Like, okay, right, all right. So the gift is the box. It's not that the box contains the gift. People want to take this attitude toward their own cultural heritage, especially Christmas. People in the United States of America, in Western Europe especially, they want to kid themselves into thinking that they can keep the packaging, they can keep the container. That Christmas, it's just this beautiful, decorative, empty box, and you can fill it up with anything you like. That, Christmas can be a secular holiday, that Christmas can be an atheist holiday. It can represent anything you want it to represent. If you're American specifically, people try to do this with Thanksgiving. Like, oh, it's such a nice box. Slavery, genocide, the Puritans wiping out the indigenous people, the Indians in this particular part of the eastern seaboard of the United States. Oh, we'll keep the box. And we'll fill it up with all kinds of good things. We'll give it all kinds of nice ideas. We'll say it's a holiday celebrating, some ideology more suited to our times, more suited to our tastes, so on and so forth. Right? This is a box that cuts part of your dick off. Okay, what percentage of Christian males in the United States of America are circumcised? And yes, when I talk to Christians face to face, when I talk to Jewish people face to face, I go right to the most disturbing example. The example that is the most irrevocable, the most impossible to change or compensate for or wiggle your way out of with Jesuitical reasoning, a decision that's made by your parents on your behalf while you're still an infant and you can't speak for yourself and no one represents your rights or your long-term interests, something that is as unspeakable as tattooing the word Jew on a baby's face, right? But instead, you're depriving them of 60% of the nerve endings in their penis for the rest of their life, right? And Christians do this as if they're tattooing the word Christian on a baby's face, all right? Now, I'm someone who both is Jewish and looks Jewish. There's a real sense in which I walk around with Jew tattooed on my face, and I am the target of anti-Semitism, not just on the internet, in real life. I don't just identify as Jewish. Everyone else identifies me as Jewish, and I got to deal with that. All right. Got to tell you, I remember the first time ever I confronted my father about his decision to have me circumcised, because both of my parents they consider themselves atheists. Whether or not that's really true is kind of another story. There are people who call themselves atheists who aren't, in the same way there are people who call themselves Christians who aren't. I mean, life's full of these kinds of these paradoxes. And the way my father reacted, it was completely sincere and unguarded. You'd think you were asking him why he chose the color blue when he bought his first car as a teenager. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't so much something he was making excuses for or justifying. It was just this distant memory he didn't really care about, and where he was just kind of speculating. Like, why did I choose a blue car? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I was thinking this. Maybe I was thinking that. When someone, they're not like making up an answer to try to please you or try to mislead you. They're making up an answer because they just don't give a fuck, and they never gave a fuck. It never mattered to them. It doesn't matter to them now. And they're just like, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, maybe it was this. Maybe we were thinking, well, guess what? I get to deal with the consequences for forever. But of course, circumcision isn't the only example. All right. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, communism, fascism. Do you think that all of these ideologies should be allowed to open and operate their own schools for children? Do you think they should all be allowed to open and operate their own summer camps? Now, in case you think small cult groups don't do this, they do. I mean, the Mormons are a large cult group. Scientology, medium-sized cult group. I mean, examples of that. If you listen to hip-hop music, if you listen to rap music, you may be aware of the so-called 5%er religion. All right. There are a lot of rap lyrics from Wu-Tang Clan, Puff Daddy, a lot of New York rappers or greater New York area rappers have a lot of 5% illusions, a lot of 5% mythology or philosophy, whatever you want to say, in their rap song. If you look up the history of that movement, the real turning point was when they started to get funding to open and operate their own school. Now, I forget how many years this school operated. I don't think it lasted for all that long, but they were taking in children. And always remember the emphasis in their school. I mean, to some extent, it was about kind of Black self-empowerment. There were some other themes going on there, but they emphasized mathematics and self-defense. I always thought, now, to what extent that was them using code words for what they were really teaching, I don't know. But I remember thinking, yeah, I can kind of imagine you grew up in the African-American ghetto and you think, you know what, if there are two things kids are not learning enough of in schools, in regular government schools, mathematics and self-defense. If you guys know anything about even the hip hop slang that comes out of that religious movement, they do use the word mathematics in a way that you and I do not. It is a bit of a code word, but in any case, I think they use self-defense in a way that we don't use it also. But okay. So if we're moving past the level of just acknowledging irrevocable, permanent bodily harm done by these religions, changing people's lives forever, a few moments after they're born, marking them physically and impairing them physically for the rest of their lives, men and women. You can Google it right now. How many million women are circumcised in the world, have female genital mutilation, whatever you want to call it? How many million men are circumcised? How many of them don't know why? Their parents didn't know why, right? They're just trapped in this cultural pattern that goes on and on forever. Okay. Do you think it's harmless to put a child into Catholic school? If so, you're not an atheist. All right, you're not. Right? There are atheists who will say that, and there's a sense in which I kind of don't believe them. But if you talk to them at some length and they're really sincere, they really think it does no harm to a child to be sat down and taught how to pray, taught how to confess to a priest, taught not just how to do the rituals, but you're taught what they mean, what they symbolize, what your place in the universe is. You're taught whatever the hell you're taught these days about the theory of evolution. That's changed for the Catholic Church. It's not the same for the Catholics as it is for the Protestants anymore. You're taught whatever you're taught about human sexuality and marriage and all these other things. All right. Well, I don't think that's harmless. I think people are damaged for life. And even if it's harder to see than the damage done by circumcision, all right, if you look closely enough, you can see it. Even amongst the people who consciously and intentionally reject Catholicism and start to identify as atheists or as anti-clerical, people who reject church, they are fucked up for life. I don't have time to read this book. I may never have time to read this book. This is a somewhat famous person called Tom Baker. After I ordered this book, I just Googled around to see what people say about this guy today. This is now 2022 coming up. We're in the last few days, 2021. And this is someone who was tremendously famous in the decade of the 1980s. I remember someone online, so I just Googled around to see what people were saying about him. I think I did within the last year or something. Because, again, he's not forgotten, but he's become a barely remembered, barely known cultural icon. I remember somebody saying, that for him growing up as a child in the 1980s, that Tom Baker really symbolized what it meant to be a man. He was a symbol of adult masculinity that was sort of intellectual and responsible. He was a hero, but he wasn't a physically dominant hero in the way Arnold Schwarzenegger was, in the way an action movie hero was. It's not, he didn't use a gun. He didn't take his shirt off. He didn't punch people out with his tremendous muscles. He wasn't a kung fu hero. For a lot of kids growing up at the time, I think, so this was just a comment I read from one person. I thought, wow, that must be true for a lot of kids who grew up in that era. And his show, he was the star of Doctor Who. And he was the star of that show at a turning point where it went from being a somewhat obscure cult subculture to being really a big mainstream hit show, certainly in the United States of America. If you want to talk about within England or within Western Europe, I'm sure the timeline is a little bit different. But what I remember is when his version of the show came out, his several seasons, that's when mainstream networks went back and looked again at the earlier seasons of the show and said, okay, how can we make money out of this? I think if you grew up within England, you'd have a more complex memory of from one year to the next how the show became more or less famous. The tide rose and fell. But it was a big turning point. Now, look, I'm now 43-year-old man. I'm not here saying that this show had a lot of intellectual content by my standards. I'm saying if you were an 8-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid, a 12-year-old kid watching this show, it had a lot of intellectual substance compared to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, compared to Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, cop drama movies, T.J. Hooker, compared to MacGyver. There's the cultural reference. Melissa's not really old enough to remember MacGyver. It's not really her generation. Nor am I. Yeah, anyway, I'm not quite old enough for MacGyver. Even my older sister, I think, would be more of a MacGyver person than me, generationally. So yeah, compared to the other stuff on TV, who he was and what he seemed to represent in the character he played. And as he said at the time, and he still says now, he was given no direction on how to play the character. Like, how does he portray this fictional character? How does he play the part of Doctor Who? What he was told by the director was just be Tom Baker, just be yourself. So he felt that there was a lot of himself in the character. All right. Why did I buy this book? I don't give a fuck about Doctor Who. Tom Baker is a fascinating example of someone who was completely broken by the Christian religion. And he stayed broken his whole life long. There was no putting the pieces back together. Not even after he rejected the religion, not even after he became an atheist, or not even after he rebelled against the religion. Put it that way. Not even after he became a multimillionaire movie star, whatever you want to say, became a tremendously successful cultural icon due to his position on a mainstream TV show. When he was a young man, he was a true believer, and he went to a monastery. I forget to what extent he was in seminary to become a monk, or to what extent to become a priest. Again, I haven't read the book. I haven't had time. Who knows when I'll have time, if ever. But this is the life story of a man who was broken by religion, by being inculcated with religious education at an early age, and he stayed broken. And this book tries, and I have read enough of it now, it tries to be really honest about the effects on his sexuality, right? Which, again, when I say you never get over it, it doesn't mean you stay living in celibacy your whole life, right? A lot of people rebel against it and they go the other way. They overcompensate, but they still don't really understand sexuality. They're just acting out their rage and incomprehension and what was inculcated into them differently. Tries to be honest about his sexuality, as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, how he struggled with this through the lens of religion, against the lens of religion, right? And it tries to be honest about nationalism too, national identity. Now, if you watch the news, it seems so easy for us to look at Palestinians, to look at Iranians, Iraqis, whatever, look at the ISIS rebellion, look down and say, these poor, benighted, petty people who somehow mix together religion and politics. For them, their faith is, inextricably bound up with nationalism. How about Irish people? How about Scottish people? How about English people? How about Southern Baptists in the United States of America? You think religion isn't inextricably bound up with nationalism for us too, whoever the fuck you are in the world? You think, we can talk about the Japanese, we can talk about South Koreans, we can talk about all kinds of people, we can talk about Italians, the French. really, like, take a step back, look at detachment with Christianity, and you're going to see that we really do have the same fundamental problems as Islam. The most important reason to engage in the critique of Islam is not because it is so different from Christianity, but because they are so nearly the same. They're so closely comparable. If you can get to the point of admitting to yourself that it's not just circumcision, that the problem is little kids like Tom Baker being put into religious schools, right? What next? What now? Like, already, just with those realizations, just with admitting that to yourself, the political path we have in front of us is very clear. Now, I'll digress for half a second. I'm see your comments coming in, guys. If you have a second, hit the thumbs up button. It'd be nice to have more people join and comment while I'm doing this. But obviously, I have enough. I can do this as a straight monologue, and Melissa can join at any time too. I'm not going to lean on the comments to provide me with content here, But when you're dealing with people face to face, and this may be your own parents, it may be your grandparents, it may be friends you've known since school, it may be people who identify as atheists, or even people who identify as atheist activists, who are horrified by your honesty when it comes to actually destroying the Christian church. When I actually talk about destroying religion, destroying these institutions permanently, actually talking about abolition of circumcision, actually talking about abolition of religious child education, that's when it's really useful to point out the parallels between Christianity and Islam, Christianity and whatever the worst cult is that they're afraid of that's actually, alive and operating. Like, so you think it's no problem to take a little kid and put them into a Catholic school? You think that's no problem at all? Well, how do you think about Muslim kids in madrasas? How does that look? What if it's your kid? What if we take your kid and we put them into the same school in Palestine, in Israel's occupied territories, if you want to say? How about we put them into a school operated by Hamas? How about we put them into a school operated by ISIS? These things really exist. How about they go into the regular school system, even right now in Turkey? You'd be shocked at how this is a big issue in Turkey. Is the current prime minister of Turkey has been encouraging more and more people to be in the religious school system, the revival of religious as opposed to secular education, but they have both. And I'm sure you're taking a more modern. What do you think about the the school system in Saudi Arabia? You think there aren't neo-Nazis who want to run their own school? Really? Like, in the old days, I could just say, try Google or try looking around YouTube. Now this stuff is all so censored. You're going to have to go to some other websites. You're going to have to go to, the dark web or something. You're going to have to go to censor, websites that are outside of the censorship system, because it's now harder and harder to see. You think there aren't people who want to raise their kids in a neo-Nazi school? I think most of them right now are doing homeschooling. But if that doesn't already exist, it will. Do you think there aren't communists, like within the United States of America, not even talking about China or Russia, who want to give their kids a hardcore communist upbringing? And, one of the great advantages of the era of the internet is that you get to really see and hear the reality of these things. If I just tell you to imagine in the abstract what a Christian summer camp is like, maybe it seems laughable, it seems like a joke. When you are watching the YouTube videos that are made by the Christian summer camps themselves, this is not an expose, like it's not like a critic of Christianity suggesting that we should abolish these summer camps. You're looking at promotional videos made by Christians themselves, made by the owners of the summer camps themselves to invite new students. Just look at that. And it's so damning. And it's so horrifying. And for me, at least, I can say it is disturbing and upsetting to see the reality of what they're doing with these kids. And, I'm only looking at the Christian summer camps that are in English. I'm looking at the English language. I'm sure it gets worse. You know what I mean? You can look at the equivalent for Islam. You can look at the equivalent for Scientology. You can look at the equivalent for Mormonism. All right. And now ask yourself, what happens next? In the United States of America, and by the way, we don't have to exclusively talk about, we could talk about Japan, we could talk about Taiwan, we could talk about the whole world for here. Ooh, I could tell some stories about religious schools in Taiwan. The United States of America has been on a very strange path in the philosophy of education and the politics of education, and questioning what should be the government's role in education. In the Constitution of the United States itself, not one word. No, during the period of time when they were negotiating and writing the Constitution, the federal Constitution of the United States of America, not a single thought given to it. Within the same generation, though, just a couple generations later, by contrast, look at the Constitution for the state of Maine. So it's M-A-I-N-E, if you're not American. If you look up the Constitution of the state of Maine, and then you search for words like education and school, I forget the exact wording. Whoa, what a difference. You can tell that in those few decades, since, the revolution ended, the federal government formed, almost immediately, over the course of just a few decades, within one lifetime, the question of what will be the government's role, what will be the government's responsibility in education, it grew and grew until we get into what's called the progressive era. And interestingly, during the progressive era, that was actually a period where the right wing and the left wing of the time, they found common cause, because the conservatives, even though you might think they would be opposed to government's role in education, government-controlled education, that you might think the right wing or conservatives at the time would be defending the power of the church to provide and control education. Conservatives, on the contrary, and religious conservatives who they still have a lot of money now, but they had a lot of money and control and influence then. They were convinced that government funding of education and government control of education would result in the moral upliftment of the working class. And they were aware that the working class and just poor people who are completely penniless, they didn't have access to the elite education offered by Christian schools. Most of them had access to no education at all. So that, okay, for the moral upliftment of the poor, the left and the right, so to speak, were united in supporting the first steps taken towards standardization and government provision of education. So this has emerged in the United States in this sort of unplanned way, very much outside of the constitutional framework. Nobody in America knows what the role of government is supposed to be in education. There is a debate, which I saw myself here on YouTube, between Nixon and JFK, between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. And the way they talk about government's role in education, it's completely surreal. It's just mind-blowing that at that time, this was still a totally open question. Like, you'd think this was still during the signing of the American Constitution. Talking about in this totally open-minded, hypothetical way, what role do you think government should have, if any? To what extent should education just remain the domain of donors? And, at that time, it's completely dominated by the Christian church. Now, within the last few decades, the library shelf for philosophy of education is bare, guys. There are just so few books worth reading from the last century in terms of philosophy of education. But the political debate about education in the United States of America has been dominated by the libertarians. And if you don't know what I mean by libertarian, they're basically the polite version of anarcho-capitalists. That's what we're talking about. Specifically, right-wing anarcho-capitalists. So there are some left-wing anarcho-capitalists. It's completely laughable political ideology. Okay, there was the libertarian agenda in education, and then there were basically various disorganized attempts to fight against or struggle against the libertarian agenda. I'll say a few words about that in a second. Now, I do think we probably have some Germans in the audience right now. My YouTube channel is a lot more successful in Germany than it is in Canada. And I think that reflects that Germany has a higher level of education. In case you haven't noticed, I don't live stream in German. But it is fair to say that in Germany, the memory of World War II, the memory of the Holocaust, the awareness that they were in the process of a tightly controlled government transition from fascism to capitalist democracy, right? I think that really, produced a very different culture of education, very different set of fundamental presuppositions about what the role of government in public education is. And I mean, everyone there knew, like, you had a generation where every single student in your class, either their father had been a Nazi or their grandfather or both. Like, everyone had at least one grandparent who was a Nazi. So how are you going to raise that next generation to not become neo-Nazis, to not repeat, the ideology of parents? Now, I'm not saying 100% of Germans leaned that way politically. I'm just saying this was a massive challenge, right? Oh, and in case you hadn't heard, there was this thing called communism, right? The other reason for the German government to have a kind of chokehold on public education, to control it very tightly, was, okay, we want to steer you away from fascism. We want to steer you away from the right wing, but we don't want to steer you too far to the left. If you keep going, then you start sympathizing with East Germany, you start sympathizing with Joseph Stalin, you start sympathizing with the Eastern Bloc. And, to say it was a Cold War is really an understatement. If you had been in Germany at that time, it was a very intense, ongoing struggle. So those are political circumstances within the last 100 years that I do think fostered a very different philosophy of education, culture of education in Germany. Guess what, guys? It's not enough. In case you think Germany is the great homeland of like secular, scientific, modern attitudes, in case you think Germany is the graveyard of the Catholic religion or is the graveyard of the Protestant religion, look again. It's not. All those institutions are thriving. Germans are still incredibly fucked up by Christianity. Like, I think a great comparison within Europe be to look at education in Germany, look at education in Ireland, right? They're both fucked up. I mean, they're both fucked up by religion. But Ireland did not go through any of those challenges. I mean, they weren't worried about fascism and reverting to Nazism, whatever. They weren't as worried about communism. Communism wasn't an immediate threat in Ireland that way. And, don't get me wrong, the government did have a very heavy hand in basically forming a new national ideology in Ireland. The role of the Gaelic language. There were different things you could see pushing and pulling at national education, government-funded education in Ireland. But it's nothing compared to the struggle Germany was in the midst of in the long 20th century, shall we say. All right. But my point is here just to say, as muscular and decisive as government intervention in education is in the German context, in the German example, it is still not remotely adequate to snuffing out the influence of the church. I'm saying the church just to generalize. Catholicism, Protestantism, Christianity of various kinds in Germany, Lutheranism, right? All of these religions that were in so many ways utterly discredited by the 20th century and by the Nazi experience in specific, guess what, guys? They've been revived. So I've mentioned this before. One of my employers in the past, a guy who was my boss in the past, he had been a small child during the Nazi period. So he was a very old man when I knew him. And, but, the period of Reconstruction after the end of World War II, he had more mature memories of that. But during the war itself, he'd been a small child. But the immediate aftermath, he remembered very well, or with more complexity, put it that way. His childhood memories of the Nazi period were simplistic, shall we say. But he did have some. Anyway, I remember he said to me, it was a big deal to him. He said this. He said, there are a lot of things you can't learn from archaeology. The reality of what's going on politically or culturally. He said, if 1,000 years from now, if archaeologists dig up the remains of what happened in Germany in the 20th century, they will see after the Nazi period, we were building churches everywhere. They were building new churches. They were rebuilding old churches that had been destroyed by the bombing, and they were renovating and restoring old churches that had just become dilapidated through the process of time and were now valued as cultural heritage. He said, anyone looking at those kinds of archaeological remains, they would think this was a period of intense Christian faith, of Christian revival. And he said, I lived through that period. And let me tell you, there never was a more nihilistic, never was a more atheistic period in the history of Germany. Everyone was completely disillusioned with the church. If anything, we all hated and resented Christianity. And they all knew the sense in which not just the church as an abstract institution or abstract concept, not just the sense in which the church had been attached to the Nazi party, They knew how their particular priest, their particular pastor, their particular preacher, they knew the individual people inside their church in their city or their town. They knew what they did during the war. And of course, in many cases, not only was there resentment about their role in Nazism, their role in anti-Semitism, their role in the fad ideologies and crazy pseudoscience of the day, and the reform of Christianity itself, by the way, carried out by the Nazi Party. So that's much forgot about. So-called positive Christianity, Adolf Hitler's reforms to the Christian religion during his life. A lot of people died, no matter which side they were fighting on. And the war is like, yeah, you piece of shit. You were an able-bodied man, and you were here in this pulpit preaching. You were here in this Lutheran church preaching, instead of being out there on the front lines where my brother died or my father died, like where a whole bunch of us died. You had it, you were real comfortable here in the church saying this bullshit that now nobody believes in. You know, you were a conformist to the worst kind. Okay, but here's the problem. So you just say that was just a totally human reflection and feeling from my former boss who lived through that period. Okay, the problem is in allowing the infrastructure of the church to be rebuilt. Instead of burning it down, instead of tearing it down forever, instead of decisively deciding, yeah, you know what? The history of Lutheranism ends with the Nazi period, and now it's over. You have as much ground to abolish the Lutheran Church as the Nazi Party, and really, they were the same thing, guys. During the Third Reich, they were one and the same organization. They really were. I mean, especially Lutheranism. Then Germany, you can look at the history of what happened. You could have at that time drawn a line in the sand and said, now obviously I'm not proposing that would have completely extinguished religion, but okay, if Christianity is going to exist, it is going to be some kind of completely new, completely disestablished form of Christianity that doesn't have churches and doesn't control schools, doesn't control universities, where it is stripped of its worldly power, and it doesn't collect taxes, and it doesn't collect tithes, and it doesn't get benefits from the government, and taxpayers' money are not used to build its architecture, to build its monuments or restore its grounds. Like, no, we're tearing it down, and it's going to stay different. Okay, well, guess what? It's not what Germany did. No matter how nihilistic they were at the time, for let's say 10 years or something after the end of the Nazi period, they allowed the infrastructure of the church to be rebuilt. And in so doing, they locked themselves into another century of the fucking dark ages. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. Vladimir Putin in Russia. Oh, suddenly everything I just said about Germany, it seems a lot easier to fucking admit to ourselves when it's Russia, doesn't it? What happened in Russia under communism? Yeah, the Christian church was suppressed, you can say. It really wasn't eliminated. You can talk to people who lived through that period in Russia. People were discouraged from going to church, but under Russian communism, the church didn't cease to exist. One of many paradoxes. I mean, also, by the way, in case you didn't know, when the Russian Communist Party was founded, one of the most fundamental promises was that everyone would get the same salary, like to eliminate wage inequality. Like everyone would get, you'd have a minimum wage and a maximum wage. The minimum wage would be $15, the maximum wage would be $50. Everyone's getting the same. Yeah, they never even attempted. It's one of those promises, campaign promises. This period, total economic inequality and these things. Strangely, the early promises about abolition of religion, they really just never followed through on them. But nevertheless, under Russian communism, you certainly had a powerful deterrent to the Christian faith. What happened after the Berlin Wall fell? What happened after that fateful day in 1991, as I recall, December of 1991, when for the last time the red flag was lowered over the Russian House of Parliament, over all the Russian government buildings in Moscow simultaneously, and instead they put up the old imperial tricolor. They restored the pre-communist flag. When for the last time the hammer and sickle came down, never to fly again. What happened? You didn't destroy the church when you had the chance. You allowed it to be rebuilt. You even funded it and fostered it and pretended it was just cultural heritage. You pretended that it was just an empty box, this beautifully carved empty box. Who wants to get rid of it? It has this wonderful quality of decorative art. Oh, it's only an empty box. You can put anything inside. You can put the most modern humanitarian sentiments inside. The most refined 21st century relativistic ideology can go inside. Oh, don't throw out the box. Just because it used to have something bad inside it doesn't mean it always has to. You can reuse the box. You can reuse the packaging. What do you fucking think is going to happen in the next 100 years in Russia, given what happened in the last 100 years? You think the Russian Orthodox Church is getting less powerful? It's not. It's terrifying how much money and power the Russian Orthodox Church has now. It's terrifying how much land they own. Okay? And they have schools and they have universities and they employ people. They're like a separate organized crime institution within Russia that is unbelievably powerful. And I can say it's not going to change. I'm telling you, I think it's going to get worse. They're going to get more and more powerful. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And you can speculate about to what extent the politicians of Vladimir Putin's generation, to what extent they did this just out of laziness, like they just didn't have a strongly felt view, to what extent they did it out of a sense of nationalism, like rather than religion, feeling that a part of Russianness was caught up in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Again, in that box, in that architecture, in that music, in those decorative elements. And, to what extent people really sincerely had a crisis of faith. I remember it being debated. This is right around 1989, 1991. I remember it being debated whether or not the Russian government should now censor television more, because there were these charismatic Christian leaders, spiritualists, New Age hippie leaders, who were getting on TV, and it looked like a pyramid scam. They were making a lot of money. You were asking for donations, asking for investments. They were mixing religion and fundraising and so on. And at that time, it seemed like enormous numbers of Russians were so eager for it. After being starved of organized religion under communism, there were huge numbers of them who stepped up and embraced it. But by the way, there were plenty of people, especially when you read specific biographies or autobiographies of people, you will be amazed at how many people just continued practicing their particular form of religion throughout the whole communist period. Well, for decades. And they weren't persecuted more or less than anyone else. I mean, life was miserable in Russia for everyone. Life was miserable for Communist Party cadres. Don't get me wrong. So that's easy to admit to ourselves, right? It's easy to look at Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia, our hated enemy in 2021, right? And they fucked up. Oh, they had this opportunity to break with the church forever, to embrace modern secular scientific, anti-religious, anti-clerical values, to stamp out religious education for the next generation of kids, to have the kind of decisive shift that Germany had in some ways after the Nazi period ended. Say, look, your father may have been a Nazi, your grandfather may have been a Nazi, but not you. It's going to be different for you. It's going to be different for your generation. That was wrong. This is right. We're moving on. To have that kind of really clear turning point in history. And guess what, guys? It involves coercion. In Germany, it's illegal to be a Nazi. The law is not enforced terribly strictly. You can Google right now and see there are whole towns full of Nazis in Germany. There are people getting away with it, but everyone gets the signal. This is something that is actually forbidden. This is something in the past, and we are coercively going to communicate to everyone that it must remain in the past. It's easy for us to look at Vladimir Putin's Russia and say, "Oh boy, what a lost opportunity," And now here instead, anyone have any optimism about the next 100 years in Russia? Does anyone think the power of the church is going to diminish or disappear? Let's just calibrate it. 20 years from now, I hope everyone here is still going to be alive 20 years from now. 20 years from now, who is going to be more religious? The Russians or the Italians? The Ukrainians or the Spanish? Right? I'm just being real with you. I think Eastern Europe 20 years from now is going to be more fucked up by religion than Italy. Italy is somewhat fucked up But don't get me wrong. I don't know. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's difficult to assign numbers. It'd be interesting to calibrate it. Try to come up with a scale of harm done by Christianity in any one of these kind of. Oh yeah. Russians are fucked up by Christianity, and it's not getting better, guys. It's not. And on the other hand, isn't it hard to sympathize with China? Isn't it hard to sympathize with the horrible government of evil Xi Jinping when they put the foot down and say Islam is over? No more madrasas, no more religious education. Literally, no more telling people not to eat pork. I know that may seem like a joke to you guys. I mean, I'm vegan. I don't eat pork. I also don't eat cows. But yeah, I do believe the stories about the Communist Party going and forcing people to eat pork. And it very directly mirrors their decades-long history of forcing Buddhists to eat meat generally, people who were committed Buddhists, including the former emperor at the time of the revolution, of somewhat sadistically forcing them to be non-vegetarian as part of breaking down their faith, breaking down their sense of religious identity. So it's a consistent recurring motif in the Communist Party. It would not surprise me at all. It's possible it's propaganda. It's possible there is, but it would not surprise me at all if they are sitting down with Muslims and saying, no, you're going to learn that there's nothing magical about this meat. It doesn't even taste that different from other kinds of meat. You're going to sit down and eat pork like everyone else in China. You're going to start living in the modern world and stop having superstitious beliefs about this thing. Monstrous. Oh, terrible. Unforgivable. Oh, all of a sudden, I care so much about human rights. Do you give a fuck about human rights in North Korea? Do you give a fuck about human rights in communist China? Do you give a fuck that nobody in China can vote? Do you give a fuck about human rights in Myanmar, in Cuba, in Saudi Arabia? Oh, no. In this very specific context of religious freedom in one province of China, I care about human rights. How about Buddhists in Tibet? No interest. No. No. Oh, you care about human rights? I don't. I don't think human beings should live for the next century in a museum devoted to the worst fucking errors of their past. I don't think the 22nd century should be a fucking museum to what we believed in the 14th century, where we lock ourselves into a goddamn gilded cage, a gleaming display case with our accumulated cultural heritage. Oh, look at this vase. It's so fucking pretty. Look at my Ming vase. Look at this fine tapestry. Look at this handiwork. Look at all the things we did devoted to these vulgar, idiotic cult beliefs. Look at all the paintings we have of angels. Look at all the paintings we have of baby Jesus. We're so fucking proud. Fill up your fucking house with it. Fill up your life with it. Inculcate your children with this ideology for no goddamn reason other than the fact that your great-grandparents did. Repeated forever and ever, even down to and including when it involves cutting off part of your penis, when it involves losing 60% of the nerve endings in your penis. And I've read the Bible. There is no justification. There's no great symbolic meaning to it. You can read the Bible cover to cover, asking yourself why, and there is no answer to the question why. It's the mark of the covenant of Abraham, cutting off part of your dick. That's how barbaric these beliefs are. There's nothing beautiful about it. It doesn't even compare well to the poetry of William Shakespeare. And I'm a critic of Shakespeare. I think more than half of his writing is garbage. More than half of his plays are garbage. I don't particularly like his sonnets, okay? I'm not really an uncritical fan of Shakespeare. But okay, if you've got complete works of William Shakespeare and you've got the Christian Bible, which one do you want to take to a desert island and read? Which one do you want recited at your funeral? Blah, blah, fucking blah. There's some value in some of Shakespeare's work. Want to cut off your dick for it? Huh? You want to get a fucking circumcision to symbolize your commitment to the brilliance and genius of fucking William Shakespeare? All right. The future of atheism cannot be tolerance for religion. Because in case you haven't heard, one, religion doesn't have tolerance for us. 2, each religion has nothing but intolerance for all of the other fucking religions. Do you think it's harmless to send your kid to a Sunni summer camp? You think it's harmless to send your kid to be raised in a Shiite Muslim fundamentalist school? I'll tell you one thing. I want you to have 2 kids. Raise one of them Sunni and one of them Shiite so they fucking hate each other. How's that sound? Right? The only reason why we can see this so clearly is the otherness of Islam. Okay? It's that it's remote enough, it's alien enough for us that we can perceive in Islam the same fucking problems that are there with Judaism and Christianity. They're just more familiar. Gonna take a moment to read comments from the audience. Melissa, if you'd like to join in.
For reasons, I was looking up videos lately of Christmas music. For critical reasons.
Yeah.
I'm writing something about Christmas. So I saw a family that had posted music videos of themselves with their children. Their 6-year-old daughter was singing these Christmas songs. And just to me, it hit the, it's exactly what you've been saying. Like, I really don't think this is good for children. And I do see the real harm. And in my family, having seen how different people, different personality types, different characteristics in cousins and distant cousins, how they've responded once they grow up, once they get out of the Christian household, how they respond. One of my relatives, or one of my distant relatives, has become a homeless drug addict, basically. And I know it's because he was messed up because of Christianity, going to not a religious summer camp, but basically a boot camp to become more well-behaved. It's just, I have seen plenty of these examples of children growing up and being screwed up by their religion that they were inculcated with, messed up for a long time.
And look, I think,
it's happening now.
Right. The Dark Ages are not over yet. The Dark Ages will end when we end them, when we force them to end. It's not going to end voluntarily. Go on, yeah.
Children today are celebrating Christmas, celebrating and singing songs to commemorate the birth of Jesus. This is something that we have to be really strong in this, and that we don't accept it. We don't want it anymore.
Anyway, not every movement needs leadership. I think there are forms of social change that can come about without leaders and without followers. I think there are. The nature of the challenge we've got in facing down 5,000 years, 10,000 years of religious tradition, I think it does need leadership. I think it does require leadership, whether that leadership is overt or covert. I think you can have an organization that's secretive, frankly, that's a conspiracy, frankly, but it's not going to happen without leadership. And, there is this quotation from Karl Marx. I'm an anti-Marxist and an anti-communist, by the way. That's your first time saying what I'm not a Marxist. To paraphrase and truncate it slightly, religion is the opiate of the masses. It's the soul of a soulless world. I don't believe that. I disagree with Karl Marx. I think egotism is the opiate of the masses. I think what people really like is feeling special and feeling superior to others, especially in ways that are completely unearned and unmerited. Believing in their intrinsic superiority rather than just being superior because you practiced shooting a basketball for 100 hours and now you can shoot a basketball well. People who have the humbling process of earning their superiority are rarely on the same kind of nature. I think the opiate of the masses is egotism, and I think religion can provide that, and I think atheism can provide it also. It's thus very distressing for me to see the extent to which atheism And the leaders of the atheist movement are so completely disabled by egotism. They're disabled by this same opiate masses. Now, in case you know, my family religion was Judaism to a large extent. My father had been a convert to Christianity, and he had more than a decade of being a crazy extremist Christian. He wasn't just a little bit Christian during his Christian period, but my mother was Jewish, and thus I am considered genetically Jewish, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I grew up in a very haunted household, in this way. But one of the aspects of Judaism is, of course, this notion of being the chosen people, being special, just for being born into this tradition. And I got to tell you, I think that that's not a distinctive aspect of Judaism. I think that's exactly what Judaism has in common with every other religion. You can meet Zen Buddhists who feel special because they're born into Zen Buddhism. You meet Zen Buddhists who feel special because they converted to Zen Buddhism. And you can meet Christians who feel special because they're Christian, so on down the line. It's true. It exhibits itself somewhat differently, the sense of specialness, when you're talking about a minority religion as opposed to a dominant majority religion. But still, Americans can feel special just because they're American, just because they're part of this nationality, this ethos, this constitution, this history, this democracy, whatever it is. Nationalism is a mass phenomenon, but it still involves this sense of being chosen. It sickens me to see the same fundamentally religious attitude exhibited by the leaders of the atheist movement. The leaders, certainly within my lifetime, all of them that have come and gone. You want to jump?
Yeah, I just want to say, it resonated with me what you said about Christians, people who are religious. They're antagonistic to atheists. It's not like they're accepting of atheist people. They don't have the same kind of, we're supposed to tolerate religious people, but religious people don't tolerate atheists.
Yeah.
So
the most fundamental premise of Christianity is, I'm right, you're wrong, so when you die, you go to hell. Now, different Christians cope with this in different ways. Some say that you should have this kind of loving and snide attitude towards atheists and non-believers, kind of invite them in. And some are more harsh and condemning and so on. But yeah, tolerance is a lie. Now, I'll just say, if you guys want, I can talk about this for an hour solid. The notion of tolerance that is very much written into the American Constitution, the notion of tolerance that existed in the United States of America at the end of the Puritan period, or we might say it's a few decades after Puritanism has kind of lost its luster, but very much influenced by the brief but bright burning candle of Quakerism in the United States. And Quakerism is basically one of several Puritan ideologies and movements. Puritanism isn't one thing. It isn't one church. It was a wave of enthusiasm that came and went. The notion of tolerance at that time, it didn't apply to Black people. It didn't apply to American Indians. It didn't apply to anyone but quote unquote us. It didn't even apply to Catholics. All right. The notion of tolerance in the United States of America at that time is a unique product of the English Civil War. And you got to understand what was going on in Christianity in England before the English Civil War, because it really did cause it in part. It's not the only cause. It's one of the most important causes of the English Civil War. What happened during the Civil War era, during the dictatorship, so to speak, that follows after the Civil War. The brief period of some democracy followed by dictatorship, what do you want to say? And then, say a century afterward, the long shadow of what happened. They, came to this notion that the best way for Christianity to move forward, the best way for it to advance, was to have this very limited freedom of religion, this tolerance of basically having different puritanical Protestant churches competing with one another, lively discourse. And this was a period of history when alcoholism was basically 100%. The amount of alcohol people was drinking is unbelievable. And these groups, they believed in, shall we say, hearing voices. They believed in feeling the spirit of the Lord come into you, and you hit your feet on the ground, and you stammer and speak in a supernatural voice and so on. They believed in superstition in its most crass form, and it didn't last. Like even I'm sorry, talking about centuries. I'm not saying it wasn't just one summer. It wasn't just a few. I mean, obviously, it changed the fate of the world. Don't get me wrong. But no, it wasn't sustainable. Now, many of these religions aren't. I'll just mention. There was/is a religion called Subud. One of the few YouTube channels, Subud of Montreal, is still uploading videos. Why are some forms of religion more durable than others? Subud also was based on this notion that you put yourself into this state of possession by a spirit, so to speak. You put yourself into this very strange state where they would. So it's not a trance. The reason I'm not saying trance, I'm aware technically of what a trance is. But in any case, Subud, it's not that different from what the Quakers used to do, where you'd put yourself in this state of mind and they'd either get on stage or stand in the middle of a circle of people and they'd start dancing and twitching around in a strange way and speaking or singing in a strange way. This spontaneous, all these words in English are so loaded. If I say it's possession, well, what are you possessed by? Some forms of Christianity, you're possessed by the quote unquote Holy Spirit. But regardless of the kind of philosophical justification, well, I think you can imagine that's the sort of thing that can motivate people and recruit people. It's a kind of religious experience, an altered state of mind that can have a big impact on people for 10 years. How do you raise your own children in it? How do you establish and manage institutions that last for a century with it? Take a look at Quakerism today. Almost all of the distinctive aspects of the Quaker faith and its founding years have disappeared. They're aware of them, but same with Mormonism. Mormonism as it exists today is totally different from Mormonism in the life of the prophet. Mormonism today, on the outside, it looks so much like any other form of mainstream Christianity. You do a little bit of digging and you find out all the crazy things they believe in, at least on paper. But many Mormons will tell you their own religion is only 10% different from Christianity. That's a lie, but it may be a lie they tell themselves. So in terms of in these religions, once they institutionalize, once the centuries start to pass, that's one of the aspects. But anyway, we have a cultural and political memory of tolerance. Tolerance as defined during the English Civil War. Switzerland doesn't. Look at the history of Christianity in Switzerland, right? So Switzerland, the great homeland of Protestantism, that's where Zwingli had his debates with Martin Luther. Okay, guess what? As soon as the debates were over, as soon as the debates were over, Zwingli and his followers, they start persecuting everyone who disagrees with them on any doctrinal point. The Swiss tradition, even though Protestant, it's not Catholic, it's Protestant, they're out there persecuting heretics. And today, of course, what was considered heretical, it's like minor disagreements about exactly what happens in the doctrine of transubstantiation when you eat a magical wafer or drink, like really minor things about different kinds of baptism or something. No, this is life and death to them. These are, the nature of the persecution is incredibly violent. Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo, make up your mind. Got to be on one side or the other. So I just say, like, Swiss Protestantism was not part of that tradition in England at all. Now, I think some other parts of Europe actually were influenced by it more or less. I think the Netherlands has always been very tightly bound to what's going on culturally and politically in England. You can make a case in some of them. Anyway, they're across the water from them and so on. Another story to be told there. But yeah, so we are burdened with a false ideology of tolerance, a notion of tolerance that only ever existed to serve a certain type of narrow instrumental purpose within doctrinaire Protestant Christianity. So there's one interesting comment here from Turnval. So Turnbull, I wonder how my whole life would be different if I'd settled in Scandinavia, whether Sweden, Norway, whatever. But I'm aware in most of the studies about atheism, most of the studies say that the country that has gone the furthest toward atheism is either Sweden, Norway, Denmark. That the Scandinavian countries, there's some statistical evidence for this, but I think it's mostly just the anecdotal experience of being there and meeting people and talking to people that it seems like everyone's an atheist. But in any case, a significant percentage of people are atheists, and that in Scandinavia, atheism has become the dominant discourse. So Turnbull writes in and says, quote, in Scandinavia, it's the opposite. Religious people accept atheists while we give them a harder time. Okay, but here's the problem I still want to put to you, Turnbull. The power that a parent has over their own child. Now, we have traditions in Canada of tattooing your face. And there are talks now about reviving those traditions because most of them were eliminated by Christianity. They were forced to cease to exist by Christian missionaries. And I saw one YouTube video from one woman who's Inuit. Genetically, her ancestry is Inuit, what people commonly call Eskimo still. And she made the decision to tattoo her face in the tradition of her great-grandmother or something. I forget how many generations have been in her family since they had this, but there are still some photographs of what those tattoos look like. Well, I think it is one thing for an adult to make the decision to tattoo their own face. And we probably do need laws about exactly when you're an adult. When do you get to make the decision to tattoo? Is it 18? Is it 16? Is it 14? Is it 21? It's a big decision to tattoo your own face. It really is. But I think probably everyone in this audience immediately, just because that is an act of rebellion against Christianity, to say you're going to recapture the appearance of your great-grandparents before Christian missionaries arrived, there's a sense in which we sympathize with that. On the other hand, it also represents a kind of superstition and a kind of religion that none of us would sympathize with. We don't want to return to worshiping the evil spirit that's at the bottom of the ocean that catches fingermen and drags them down to the bottom of the sea. Sorry, Inuit mythology it's very evocative in this way. But, the water there is unbelievably cold and deadly. So a big part of their cultural experience is anyone who falls over the side of the boat is almost immediately dead. Whether they sink or swim, if you get them out of the water, they've been so totally chilled that they don't recover and so on. So this idea that falling in the water is death influences a great deal of their religious imagery. And I used to research this stuff. I was in a university program. I read an account of a Christian missionary who, at least in his area, introduced writing for the first time to the Inuit. So I know, it's a huge area. So I'm not saying this is definitive. This is the first white man to teach them how to read and write anywhere in that area. But in any case, in his area, none of them had the concept of reading and writing before, and he came and explained them. And at that time, Inuit culture was very vibrant. It hadn't been exterminated by European influence yet. And so he's talking them through how the phonetics work. And then the first thing he writes on the board, it's in Inuit, it's their equivalent of, Kichimanito in Korean Ojibwe, so they have a word language for the great spirit, for this kind of this monotheistic God who to some extent is bigger than all the other gods, or actually includes them. They have this kind of idea that there's a kind of mega God, even though they have stories about smaller gods also, and then he wrote, I forget if it was on a chalkboard. He wrote on some surface. This is the Arctic. They probably didn't have a chalkboard. It was probably, I don't know what the hell he was writing on. He was writing on something that could all read. He wrote in the phonetics. He had just explained to them how the phonetics didn't work. He wrote, "The Great Spirit loves you." And all of them were stunned in silence. And they sounded it out, and they looked at each other, And it's not that they didn't have that concept. They had the concept of God. They were terrified of God. For them, God or gods, that was the thing at the bottom of the ocean that pulls you down to be trapped forever at the bottom of the sea. I mean, there's a lot of fear and trembling in Inuit, mythology. And here was this guy telling you, the one true God, loves you. This message of love and so on. And this is a stunning, turning point in their religion. Yeah, it's easy to sympathize with someone who wants to tattoo their own face. What if this same woman has a child and now wants to tattoo the child's face when they're still a baby, when they're 8 years old? Like maybe they can talk, but they're not really at a level to understand the consequences of this decision. You know, even in Scandinavia, I'm just being honest with you, I don't plan to ever spend time in Scandinavia. I can imagine in a different life I would have ended up there. Partly because I hear really good things about the university system. Like that alone is a reason for me to move to another country. By the way, just being real with you, I've also done research and I've read a lot of bad things. I've heard both. I did do enough research to realize you have a lot of really deep problems with university education. No, I do know that. But nevertheless, compared to Canada, I can imagine that I could have ended up, somewhere in Scandinavia. But in Scandinavia, if you think you've won, I really disagree, because of the power parents still have over children, the power they have to tattoo their own faces, tattoo the faith of their ancestors onto those children. Obviously, religious upbringing, religious education, and so on. And yeah, I could do a documentary movie about it. We could go to Scandinavia. We could really interview people and do research and ask. Call it something like Scandinavia. Have we won yet? I don't know. Come up with a catchy title, but questioning, is this victory? Is this the end point for atheism? And I can tell you right now, I think my conclusion would be no. That you can't be complacent, that this hasn't gone nearly far enough. And both geographically and culturally, I would put to you the possibility. What if Scandinavia is in a transition now of gradually drifting over toward the same kind of normalcy, represented by Russia, the Ukraine, Eastern Europe? I mean, I know culturally and linguistically you're different people, but I mean, look at Finland. I'm sorry, your history is not easily extricated from Russia specifically. It's the giant next door. You could drift back toward being a more religious country. Again, if you don't take really decisive steps now. But yes, I mean, I think Scandinavia provides a fascinating set of contrasting examples, and the role of religion and education and culture and politics there. I just mentioned in Germany, several of the most powerful political parties identify their religion in the name. The Christian Democrats being the most obvious. But which parties are Christian, which parties are specifically Catholic and Protestant and so on, that's written right on the ticket there. Now, any of us would regard that as barbaric in Iraq. Any of us would regard that as barbaric in Iran. Oh, how can you have it's actually an issue in Syria too, the different form. Alawite Islam is different from the other forms of Islam and so on. Oh, how can you have a political party or a political faction that's defined by its religious affiliation? Well, you've got that overtly still in Germany in the 21st century. And I remember, I crossed swords with this very powerful charity in Scandinavia, Swedish Church Aid. I think that's the name. Sorry if I'm getting the name slightly wrong. So maybe it was even Scandinavian Church Aid, I forget. But I know there were very, very powerful church charities, and they were fucking things up for us in places like Laos and Cambodia, where I had to deal with them. Anyway, I remember people from Scandinavia saying, "Oh, but you have to understand these organizations, they're barely Christian." And I know what they're comparing it to. I know those organizations, they're not as Christian as like American missionary outfits. But guess what, guys? In terms of the future of Laos and Cambodia, no, this is a very potent form of Christian influence. Just reading through your comments. Oh, so yeah, one of the saddest issues of all here, our regular contributor, Do You Want to Give Me a Kiss, says, quote, atheists, 1 child per couple, evangelicals, 3 children per couple. Well, the statistics are even more worrying than that. And there's a question, are we talking about the United States? Are we talking about Saudi Arabia? Are we talking about Palestine? Are we talking about Israel, Judaism within Israel? So you have to disaggregate the data. And no, so we do this in social science statistics all the time. This is normal procedure for data analysis in political science or whatever you want to say. Of the families who have 7 children in Israel, what percentage are atheist? Of the families who have 6 children in Israel, what percentage of atheist? Of the families that have 5 children, 4 children, 3 children, 2 children, 1 child, 0 children, right? So you have to break it down and make a bar chart that shows those splits. That's where you really see the difference. So yeah, the statistic you're using is probably an average. Like on average, evangelicals have 3 children. Well, yeah, but that's an average. When you look at the upper end of the spectrum, who are the people having 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 children? They're almost all religious maniacs. Now, some are Christian, some are Jewish, some are Muslim, but it is incredibly rare to find an atheistic modern secular person who has, let's say more than 4 children. But I think as you go up the chart, you'll see like almost all of them have either 0, 1, or 2 children, and thus the average is down there. Now, there are reasons. And again, by the way, my father would be to say ashamed would be to totally misrepresent his character. He was incapable of feeling shame. But my father would not be able to cope with my saying this openly. The reason why my father had so many children was that he used to be a crazy Christian. He used to be committed to a form of charismatic Christianity. And then, he always was left-wing. He was a left-wing crazy Christian, but then he moved on into this different phases of his communist identity. He then wanted to misrepresent his past as if he always had been a communist. And there's some truth to that. He wasn't conservative when he was a Christian maniac. But he would not have had nearly so many children if he hadn't been, for those, say, 10 years roughly, committed to a strange form of Christianity. And by the way, for some reason, his form of Christianity, legal marriage, celibacy, not so much. People pick and choose. Getting a whole bunch of random hoe bags pregnant, that was his form of Christianity. And, he could back it up. Read the Old Testament. There were a lot of guys having kids with a lot of different women in the Old Testament. Like if you actually read the Bible, in the New Testament, there's enough of that too. The New Testament is just shorter and there's less about family. But there's enough material. So he could justify getting all these women pregnant. Here, you can just quote chapter and verse. There's enough of that in Christianity. And as I've said many times under many different headings, the excuses are harder to quit than the thing itself. Yeah. So look, coming back to the very real, very palpable, very important issue here, introduced by, do you want to give me the kiss? What do you think the future of Israel is just 20 years from now, given this fact? And by the way, we can repeat this within Palestine or whatever you want to call it, the occupied territory, whatever term you want to use. Within the occupied territories, you can do a similar chart for Muslims. Okay, how many people are having 7 kids? Or I don't know if you got to start at 9 or 10. How many people have 10 kids, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? How many people are religious who have many kids? And then when you get down to the lower numbers, what percentage of people are atheist versus religious? In this case, meaning Muslim predominantly. And then what's the knock-on effect of that? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and so on. Israel already is a country dominated by religious maniacs. Some of them are Muslim maniacs. Some of them are Jewish maniacs. There's a very influential Christian maniac minority in Israel. Even though they may not have big numbers, they're organized and well-funded. There are Christians in Israel, and they're very passionate. And you can imagine why. And, the people who have modern secular, atheist, anti-clerical attitudes, they're overrepresented in all the walks of life that are actually getting shit done, right? Like you can live your life in Israel today. You can live in Haifa or any of these places. And it seems like everyone you meet is secular or atheist. Everyone you meet at the vegan restaurant, everyone let's say you work in the banking system or something, any kind of high level executive people. It seems like all the time you're dealing with people who are either just barely nominally religious or they're actually anti-religious and non-religious. Yeah. But that minority is getting smaller and smaller, and they're becoming voiceless. And if you live in Israel and you have a child and put your child into a school, what is the effect of putting your child into a school where the vast majority of the other children are unassailable in their religious convictions, where they're the local majority, so to speak? Again, I think any of you would be terrified to put your children into an all-Muslim school where your child is the one atheist in a school where everyone else is a Muslim. Well, within Israel, both for all three, for Jewish people, for Christian people, and for Muslim people, it becomes impossible for the exceptional atheists to really raise their children as anti-religious, shall we say, unless you commit to, homeschooling, unless you commit to raising your kids totally cut off from the society that surrounds them. Do you want to jump in on that, babe? So it's not just long-term demographic change that's the problem with religious people having more kids than secular and atheist people, right? There are also, issues of kind of direct short-term cultural influence and, frankly, bullying. That is your experience in school. If your experience in school is all the teachers are Muslim, all your classmates are Muslim, everyone's participating in these religious rituals, everyone's talking about, oh, what are you doing this weekend? The same way for many of us, we grew up with people talking about their plans for Christmas. It's just the most natural thing. You grew up immersed in that. Well, then just sustaining an atheist minority becomes a constant act of quite dangerous defiance and rebellion. And so, yeah, this factor alone, can we ever win? There's someone in the audience who's using the name Food Favors, and their parents enrolled them in a Catholic school for a few years, not clear how many years, and then later he or she was enrolled in a madrasa, in a mosque, so an Islamic school. So both were for at least 5 years. So Catholic education for at least 5 years, and then madrasa for at least 5 years. And he or she says that he or she learned Arabic and had to memorize the Quran. So they did the memorization and recitation of the Quran. Very simply, this contributor in our audience says, quote, no good memories from the Catholic or the Islamic school. Yeah. So Frida says, it is very damaging. You develop superstitious thought patterns, even when you're not religious anymore. So, guys, under a bunch of different headings, people have told me that I should be a therapist, partly because they're concerned about my ability to make money, which is a reasonable concern. How am I ever going to earn a living? And, people sometimes say that because they've seen my videos talking about drug addiction and sobriety, or they see my videos about video game addiction and self-discipline, or they see my videos that are in a philosophical way talking about living a meaningful life. They've seen what I have to say under different things. But even the videos I made talking about fitness and exercise and stuff, people say, oh, you should be a therapist. You should get some kind of license or credential so you can be a therapist and help people one-on-one and earn a living doing it. If you were a therapist, how would you actually help these people? So you guys know her if you've been watching my channel. I know one ex-Mormon. Some people here are mentioning examples of ex-Mormon. I know one ex-Mormon. And by the way, I'm not going to say anything that she hasn't put on the internet herself, either on YouTube or on podcasts. She used to do both. Her name used to be American Unicorn, which, by the way, was a name I gave her. It's a funny story. She changed her YouTube channel had a different name before, but her YouTube channel and Instagram, she changed them all to American Unicorn because of a comment I made about her in passing on my channel. Okay, she was raised Mormon, and when I first knew her, she was completely devout, committed Mormon. She went from being anorexic to being an obsessive bodybuilder.
Sorry, I don't.
Alexa, stop. She went from being anorexic to being an obsessive bodybuilder. She went from being a devout Mormon to being an atheist. She went from sobriety to some moderate level of use of, I think, marijuana and alcohol and that kind of thing, soft drugs. At least she was drinking alcohol. I forget if she smoked marijuana and so on too. And she also went from being vegan to being a meat eater. She had all these very strange transformations in her life. And oh yeah, I mean, again, I'm not going to give any details, but she was pretty public about this. She went from, being a virgin until marriage and only having been with one man to, shall we say, a more liberal position in life and more diverse experiences in life. So I don't know how much of that is still on her Instagram. I think, like a lot of people, I think she later deleted some of her comments on Instagram and stuff, some of her posts. Fine. It's totally her. It's not fair to say, looking at her life, that she had one period of being damaged by religion and then a period where she was fine and she had recovered. Like both periods, all of these extremes, she's still fucked up by religion in the before and after. She's just coping in different ways. And, again, I'm not putting words in her mouth or something. You can look at her period of being an anorexic. And at that time, I believe she was a virgin. She was, celibate until marriage. You can look at that as her coping with her religious upbringing, with the faith inculcated into her. And you can look at her period of rebelling against that in different ways, her period of bodybuilding and so on. It's not like one is the problem and one's the solution. Like they're both imperfect, tragic, psychopathological ways of coping with the same religious upbringing. And look, I don't know her like that. I know her pretty well. I know her better than my own brothers and sisters. I don't know. I'm not on any kind of speaking terms with any of my brothers and sisters. It's not saying much, but I know her to a limited extent. I know about a lot of things in her life that are not on the internet, and I'm not going to divulge. There is no before and after. I mean, sorry, again, same with Tom Baker. It's not like there was this period before where she was damaged and then there's after where she's not damaged anymore. It's like looking at her life, there's a series of struggles to cope with the way in which she's broken, and she remains this broken person. I'm sure she wouldn't like my saying that, but on the other hand, if we were having a face-to-face conversation, her and I, and talking about it, I'm sure I could state it in an inoffensive way that she'd probably agree with and reflect on. And now, a lot of people like that. I mean, Aaron Janis claims to be. I can't trust. I mean, in terms of what she says in her YouTube videos, you tell me. But Aaron Janis has one video up that I've shared the link to before, where she's talking about her religion and her religious upbringing. But she isn't honest in that video with the extent to which she flip-flopped. Like she was involved with a kind of authoritarian traditional Christianity for one period of her life, but she was involved with a lot of other weird spiritual stuff in other periods of life, and exactly what the timeline is. But anyway, she's someone who flip-flopped between different religious extremes. And again, they're all coping mechanisms. There is no before and after. It's not that before this was a problem and now you're done with it. So you want to jump in? Yeah.
I was going to say that video was with the documentary, the vegan filmmaker who
I know.
Yeah. So I just say she is another example of somebody who had.
Oh yeah. Okay. So it's Maggie. So I'll tell her story a little bit. So Maggie, it's incredibly boring. Sorry, don't shout out YouTube videos that are as boring as watching paint dry. But so Maggie is this vegan filmmaker, and she made the video with Aaron Janis talking about her religious struggles. I guess it's a question. Maggie, from her own perspective, she had a before and after, that she had a religious upbringing, and now she's over and done with it. But that's not my perspective on Maggie. So again, I'm not saying anything private about Maggie. She's someone I have spoken to privately, but only here I'm going to say things that she's said publicly in her own YouTube videos. She reacted to Christianity, which in her form of Christianity had taught her to be a virgin until marriage, only ever have sex with one man, and to raise children with that man. She reacted against that by becoming an anti-natalist, frankly, hyper self-indulgent slut. I'm not, misrepresenting her too much. She had this period of her life of really sleeping around, of really aggressively pursuing one-night stands. And she was working basically in a nightclub. She was doing venue side management related to stand-up comedy. So, and it's a kind of, people are getting drunk, people are laughing, people are enjoying themselves. And she has been very honest in saying she had this period of her life of, sleeping with stand-up comedians and so on. Now, I don't think she only slept with stand-up comedians. Okay, so, you can look at that. Are you going to say, yeah, before you were sick and damaged and now you're cured? Again, sorry, talking about this guy, Tom Baker, like every stage of his life is coping with the damage done to him by religion. And, there's cosmology involved. What is the darkness to you? What do you see in the shadows? What do you see in your dreams? What are the symbolic significance of things in your life? How do you think about the world? How do you think about the last 5,000 years of history and the next 5,000 years of history? I'll give this maybe a remarkable or unusual comparison for you guys. But Elon Musk is popularizing the notion that this planet Earth is something we can discard and move on from. He believes that human beings can live on Mars. And in the immediate future, he keeps giving these projections like within 10 years, within these really short time span, and he keeps blowing his deadlines too, because he's been doing this for a long time. He keeps saying there are going to be these miraculous advances towards having human life on Mars. Now, one of the reasons why I'm such a harsh critic of that, why I warn people against this mentality, is that it changes your cosmology. It changes your view of what the world is and what the life is over, say, a 10,000 year time span, the 5,000 years before, the 5,000 years after. Okay. Now, look, the reality is, in terms of the laws of physics, we will never have a self-reliant human population on the moon or Mars. If human beings ever do live there, it will be in exactly the same circumstances as they're currently in the space station in orbit, meaning they rely on Earth for water and food and so on. It is not possible. It's actually easier to produce food in orbit around the Earth in a satellite. It would be completely impossible to farm on Mars, to raise food on Mars. Just very briefly, one of the reasons for that is that if you're in orbit around the Earth, at least the sunlight you get from the sun is of the same intensity as Earth. You don't have the atmosphere, you have other disadvantages, but at least you got the sunlight to work with. On Mars, you don't even have the sunlight. But you don't have sunlight, you don't have soil, you don't have any of the things taken for granted. Well, some people would say, isn't it just harmless for people to grow up with science fiction assumptions about the future of life on Earth, the future of life on Mars? I don't think it's harmless at all. I think it has real world consequences here and now. Well, in this way, inculcating children with a certain kind of cosmology, with a certain view of, yes, even the geography of the world and the timeline of world history, past, present, and future. And for most Christians, most Muslims, and a significant percentage of Jews, this timeline includes the end of the world. The idea that this whole planet is going to be discarded. That has consequences for ecology. It has consequences for whether or not you think it's perfectly morally acceptable to kill and eat cows every day, to have more than 1 billion people killing and eating more than 1 billion cows on the same planet. We're going to run out of water. We're going to run out of, all these terrible ecological consequences of that. Well, if you think the world is going to end when Jesus comes back, if you think the world is going to end on Judgment Day, if you think the world only exists to be a plaything for the short-term delectation of human beings, then there isn't much of a moral argument to care about how many billion cows there are dying for basically human entertainment, right? These things have this on this cosmological level, these things really matter. It changes the way you see the world when you're awake, it changes the way you see the world when you're asleep. It changes your whole life forever, including when you are in that phase of your life of rebelling against it. So look, I've said this before, and again, the main reason why sexuality comes up in these conversations is just because it's so easy to visualize. Like, for example, the status of homosexuals in Christianity and the lies they're told, and so-called gay conversion therapy. It's very easy to see the harm being done. The kind of cosmological things we're talking about here, it's much harder. Because I've said before in other contexts, I try to be sex positive. I try. It's kind of an uphill battle. It's kind of a positive. There are so many bad things about sex, frankly. There's so many ways in which it destroys people's lives and prevents them from leading a meaningful life. There are a lot of bad things about sex, but I try. I try to be sex positive. I think in principle, we sort of ought to be, despite all the disadvantages of it. Okay, sex is one thing. The human ego is another. What you get with a lot of ex-Christians is people having sex just to prove they can. People having sex as an act of rebellion against the church, as an act of rebellion against their upbringing. Sex to prove that you're smarter than your own parents or grandparents, to prove that you're smarter than your school teachers. You may have had school teachers who inculcated Christian morality into you. Sex, and again, I don't believe religion is the opiate of the masses. I believe egoism is the religion of the masses. Sex, attached to your ego in this way. It's very easy for those people to say that they're now ex-Christian or post-Christian and atheist. A lot of people, they still are haunted by it. They still are damaged by it. And of course, my own father is an example. My father was such a nutcase. A lot of time I don't feel he's worth talking about, just because when you're dealing with people of really extremely abnormal psychology, it's not going to be very meaningful for anyone else in the audience to talk about it, But sure, my point being, living your life in defiance of religion, this still isn't atheism. This still isn't the end goal of atheism. It's being in a position of genuine indifference towards religion, where we regard, the religion of Christianity, the religion of Judaism, the religion of Islam, where we regard these Judeo-Christian religions with the same sort of indifference as, learning about a quaint, ancestral cult we'd never heard of before from some distant ancient people, who've already lived and died on this earth more than 1,000 years ago. The same way it's merely of academic interest to talk about the religious beliefs, for example, of the ancient Romans. The preposterous notion in ancient Athens and ancient Rome of, dissecting a bird and examining its internal organs to foretell the outcome of a battle. We can read about that, and it has no power over us, including we do not feel we need to rebel against it in any way. That's the end point. That's the end goal of atheism. And I'll say now, guys, I'm going to take a moment to read your comments again. But, how do we get there? Well, one huge part of the struggle has to be cultural production. It has to be the production of new songs, new stories, new rituals, new cartoons to really challenge and replace the Christian ones. That's not the whole struggle. It's not the whole story. For me, it's not enough to open an atheist school. We have to actually shut down the Christian schools. And if you aren't willing to be honest with yourself about that, you're not an atheist. You're not anti-clerical. I'm sorry, very brief digression, but some of you people don't know this. Some of you have never thought this through before, okay? If you feel that a vegan diet is just a personal choice that improves your own life, but you're completely indifferent to whether or not your own husband or wife eats meat in front of you, has meat in your fridge, is buying meat with your money, you know what I mean? And is cooking meat on your positive basis, if you are completely indifferent to whether or not your own children eat meat, whether or not your own work colleagues eat meat, whether or not your own parents and grandparents eat meat, if you just regard this as a fad diet that you're doing for your own health or doing for your own amusement, then there is a very meaningful sense in which you are not vegan at all. You're just eating vegan food, right? Because the most fundamental premise of veganism is it doesn't matter if I eat meat or you eat meat. As long as someone is paying money to produce beef, to produce leather, this same industrialized system of production carries on, right? So it absolutely, inevitably, and inexorably must be that if I am vegan, I want you to be vegan also. I want all humanity to be vegan, or as large a percentage as we can get to. Now, of course, that is a desire that is going to be frustrated. It's not the point. I'm not commenting on whether or not that's an attainable desire. Most desires worth talking about are unattainable, okay? Yes, this really is implicitly built into the definition of veganism. Oh, yeah, it makes no sense to call yourself an atheist if you think atheism is just something you dabble in for your own amusement or your own entertainment, that it just improves your own life. But you're completely comfortable with taking your own child and putting your child into a madrasa to be forced to memorize and recite the Quran, to carry out these rituals, to have inculcated in them. If you think your atheism dies with you, your own children will revert to the religion you have rejected, right? This makes no sense. And I know your own brothers or sisters have children. So look at your brother, look at your, like maybe you don't have children. Your whole family is having children and raising the next generation in the same traditions, in the same religion, the same superstitions, the same beliefs as your great-grandparents. If you don't have a problem with that, if you don't want to challenge and change that, you're not an atheist. Right? And then, yeah, you can scale it up and you tell me when we're talking about on the scale of minds. I just say, this comes back to one of the first things I said in this video. The opiate of the masses is not religion, it's egotism. What I see dominating the American atheist movement, the British atheist movement, and the Australian atheist movement, because they're all on YouTube together, these people, the English-speaking atheists. What I see dominating these movements is the belief, the smug conviction, in one's own superiority. And then they look down on these other people and say, oh, well, that's fine for them. That's fine for people like my brother. My brother, he's not the sharpest tack in the stack. People like my brother, that's fine that they carry on with that. For those people, that's fine. But not for supposedly elite, special people like you and I. So the egotism leads to this very strange form of depoliticized indifference. The egotism leads to a kind of social irresponsibility, even for your own brother and sister, let alone on the scale of millions for your fellow man. Now, look, I just mentioned here, if you are evaluating the democracy of ancient Athens, the religion of Athens had advantages and disadvantages. There is definitely a sense in which you can look at the religion of Athens, or more broadly say the religiosity of Athens, and see the way in which it contributed to the creation of democracy, the participation in democracy. We can talk about that. We can talk about the advantages of the religion of Athens. I am saying to you sincerely, in the 21st century, Christianity has no advantages. None. You're going to hear no compromise from me on this. There is no other side of the coin. There is no silver lining in that cloud. I'm saying it's all bad. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm saying to you, there is no baby. There is only bathwater. Now, ancient Athens, there were a lot of absolutely terrifying aspects of that religion, if you look into it. I would say Herodotus, if you want to know what religion was like in the ancient world, including human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, just the craziness of religion in that period, the way in which it's terrifying. I'm conceding the point that there were some positive aspects about the religion, of the religiosity of the Athenians. But wow, there were negative aspects. And if you were alive at that time, or if you walked into a time machine now, you would be an atheist in your way in Athens too. And you would have to be very careful that you didn't end up dead like Socrates. You would have to be very careful in how you moved in challenging or opposing the religious views that were predominant in your time. The religion was compulsory. There was more freedom within Athenian religion than there was in the dark ages of Catholic Europe, but you were compelled to respect and participate in all of the public cults, which occupied something like 300 days a year. I mean, there was a religious festival, not quite every day, but the number of festivals and religious observances to be attended in downtown Athens is unbelievable. It was not a small part of your time. So, I'm just, can we be honest with ourselves about what atheism means? It doesn't mean that you only find fault with the contents of the box. Doesn't mean you're going to reach inside the box and take out homophobia, take out judgment, take out hell, but that you're going to keep the box, or you're going to put new, positive, wonderful, humanitarian 21st century sentiments into the box. Love your brother and all this shit, or equality of man. Okay, you can't just take this beautiful box and take out slavery, and take out gender inequality, and take out homophobia, take out the fear of, eternal punishment in hell. Okay, atheism means you're willing to throw out the whole box. It means you're willing to burn the church down and have nothing left. Boo-hoo. We're going to lose all those paintings of baby Jesus. Boo fucking hoo. What a goddamn tragedy it will be to have lost the decorative arts of the Christian tradition. I don't like Disneyland. I don't like the Disney Corporation. I don't like Disney movies. I'm a critic. I think with Disneyland, you can take some things out of the box, put new things in, and keep the box. I do. I think Disneyland can change. I think Disneyland does not have to be burnt down. I think you can take Pocahontas out of Disneyland, and Disneyland can endure. I mean, as you guys may know, Disneyland is now more and more about Star Wars. They have Star Wars has been added to the box. Well, maybe we can make some room for Star Wars by taking out Pocahontas and just burn that. Like, maybe Pocahontas has to be fucking banished, has to be immolated. The Disney movie version of Pocahontas and all of the marketing and toys connected to it. Yeah, the time has come for Pocahontas to disappear from Walt Disney theme parks and from their list of movies you can see in it. Yeah, I do. I do think that specific film. But I am willing to concede the point. It's not all bad. There are advantages and disadvantages. And because it is a fundamentally secular organization, it's fundamentally anti-clerical and atheist even, Disneyland can change. All right. We can have a better future with Disneyland. We don't have to burn Disneyland down. But can we be honest with ourselves? All right. The future is not Christianity. The future is not Judaism. The future is not Islam. Not even a little bit. What are we willing to do to get there? I've never had one atheist YouTube channel reach out to me, cooperate with me in anyway. My memory, not even on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like not even someone sharing the link to one of my videos and saying, hey, this is great. You guys should check out this guy. Never. Not one Skype call, not one interview, not one invitation to come to an event. They're still having events. They look like really dorky fucking events. They don't look like an event I want to attend at all. Why is that? This is the reason why. All right. Even if they don't really think it through, none of them are comfortable with this part of my message, which is so fucking self-evident. It's so obvious. None of them, okay, look, amongst vegans, it's real easy to get people to agree that, yeah, the ultimate goal of veganism would be to have a 100% vegan world, to have a world in which 100% of people are committed to not eating meat, not eating cheese, etc. Right? That's not real controversial. The only pushback you're going to get is, well, what about people who are literally marooned on a desert island? What about a few tiny populations of indigenous people on remote islands in Papua New Guinea? Yeah. You get some people who are like, well, people who narrow it down to saying they want the planet Earth to be 98% vegan, and there are still 2% of people living in such remote areas or such, primitive conditions that they should be allowed to eat non-vegan. Amazingly, in 2022, it's not just controversial, but I am demonized. I am a pariah in the atheist movement. I am hated and denounced by other atheists, even here on YouTube. I am regarded as crazy and an extremist because I'm talking about a 100% atheist planet Earth. If that's not what you want, what do you want? What is your model of the future? Is it Catholic schools inculcating this religion into children forever and ever? And a lot of these people, so let's just say you yourself are a heartbroken Catholic, like Tom was. Okay. You want your own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the future. You want them to go through the same traumatizing experience you had. You endure Catholic school and you rebel against it. Like you're the tiny minority who rebel against it and become atheist and realize it's all horseshit. And you realize the extent to which you're emotionally damaged, sexually damaged, intellectually warped by this experience. You reflect on it. You think, yeah, you know what? This is the meaning of life. Let's just have it go on forever. Let's just have this repeat for all eternity. Let's even have, as in the case of Russia, the former Soviet Union, let's have the power of the church expand and increase and be more entrenched for centuries to come. That's your idea of the future? I've heard atheists say that their role, I wonder if they got this from Christopher Hitchens. Like there's probably one specific person who said this first, but I've heard it from many different people. That their role is merely to engage in the mockery of religion. That by what progress is veganism going to make if our, the engine of social change is satire? If you have vegans devoted to stand-up comedy, and again, I think the most dangerous aspect of that, the mockery-based movement, is that it all comes back to egoism. It all comes back to this notion of I'm intellectually superior to others, supposedly. That, here I am in this benighted, intellectually superior minority. I was the one kid in my Catholic school who rebelled against the system, and therefore I'm going to look down my nose at these people and make fun of them. Well, you know what? Political movements start making progress not when they're mocking other people, but when they're actually helping them. It's just ridiculous. Hey, you know what's a big problem in America? Obesity. Do you want to have a movement to improve public health through mockery, through shame, through satire? Let's have more stand-up comedians telling fat jokes and insulting people for being overweight. Is that what you want to do? Is that the future of? You want to reduce the obesity rate? You want to reduce the rate of diabetes through shame and humiliation and joking? So anyway, these are the dominant cross currents of our time. Nobody should be surprised that I am hated by Buddhists. Nobody should be surprised that I'm hated by Muslims or Christians or Jews. Jews tend to have very mixed feelings about me. I've had emails over the years from Jews trying to convert me to Judaism, wanting to pull me into the religion. I have. They didn't succeed. Anyway, of course it makes sense that I'm hated by those groups and that I'm a hated outsider. But I'm hated by atheists. That's the state we're at in the year 2022. Catching up with your comments right now, guys. So I just say, some more comments here about psychological consequences of having religious upbringing. If you regret and resent that the quality of education you had was bad, I do. Many of you may think in your lives, well, my life would have turned out so much differently if I'd had a better education in math, if I'd had a better education in chemistry, if you'd had better education in French, if you'd learned that language instead of it being this kind of alienating failure of an experience it was, your French language education, whatever it may be. But you may also reflect on some of those things in your life and think, sometimes you may reflect and think, what? If I'd had a better education in French, whatever it was, really, my life would have turned out the same way. Really, I still would have had these thoughts and feelings. I still would have gone in this direction. You might reflect that even though you maybe resent or regret that, that actually who you are, your values, your way of thinking, what direction you went in would be the same. Religion, it's the ultimate counterexample. When you're talking about the psychological effects, the emotional effects, the intellectual effects, there's a whole world of spooks. There are all these abstractions that haunt you. And if you didn't have a religious upbringing, you wouldn't even know what those words mean. You wouldn't care about them. And, your life would not be like that. Like when you look back at your life, when you look at the religious vocabulary, the way of thinking about ethics, the way of understanding yourself and who you are and your feelings and your way of thinking about fate, your way of thinking about choices you make and decisions as opposed to decisions made by God and things being in God's hands. It's really impossible to deal with how different your whole life would be if you just didn't even know those concepts, if you didn't have that cosmology. Or, obviously you would have heard about it eventually. If you were learning about that stuff for the first time at age 15 as something from a foreign culture, if your view of Christianity were as distant and exotic as your view of Tibetan Buddhism, let's say, like you're aware there is this crazy religion, Tibetan Buddhism. You're aware that they did human sacrifice and black magic and all this weird stuff and tantric sex rituals. You're aware of that. You can kind of learn about it and it's of some intellectual interest. If your relationship to Christian doctrine, Muslim doctrine, so if it were in that way too, there's no way to exaggerate what a different person you would be today. And, just your internal monologue, how it is you think about and understand your own life, how you reflect on your own feelings, how you feel about things in the split second where you first react to them. Those things are all shaped by Christianity. They're all shaped by these religions. To an extent, it's very, very hard to get to grips with, and it's very, very hard to ever get over, what it is that's thinkable and what it is that's unthinkable for you for the whole rest of your life, what it is you feel guilty about and what it is you enjoy. You can look back at your life and say, gee, if I had received a better education in music, my whole life would be different. And you can reflect on and say, what, if I'd learned to play the guitar and I had a good music teacher, really my life would be the same. You can do both. There are two sides to that. You may feel ambivalence about that. You may reflect on different ways at different times. Religion, it's all in one category. There's no kidding yourself. Your whole life would be completely different if you'd been adopted and raised by Muslim parents, if you'd been adopted and raised by Catholic parents. And it's different today because you were raised by the particular parents you had with the particular religion you had. And there is a sense in which religious people will never know what it's like just to grow up without that superstition, without that fear, without that worldview, without that cosmology. It's like being circumcised. You don't know what you've lost. As a man, you can never know what sex was like if you had the other 60% of your nerve endings. It's unknowable to you. It's unfathomable. It's impossible to imagine. Well, you don't know what your life would be like if you had grown up just without being inculcated with these religious values, this ethical system, this worldview, this cosmology. Just trying to catch up your comments, guys. Okay, so great comment again from our regular contributor. Do you want to give me a kiss? He or she says, I forget, do we know the gender of kiss? I don't even know. Okay. Let's assume I grew up without religious baggage. I would still be surrounded by it right now. Right. So I had a kind of internet friend. We're not close, and I now haven't spoken to him for many, many years. But I remember talking to this guy before I went to Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And then I talked to him again after I'd been in Montreal. And he'd lived there for many years. He'd lived in Quebec for a big part of his life. And I said to him, I just can't shake my sense of horror being surrounded by the Christian church at all times, the way I am in Montreal. I am not comfortable walking down the street there or spending any time in that city where the horizon is dominated by one Catholic edifice after another. And by the way, there are Protestant buildings competing with them because there are some Protestants that want you to come over to their side or whatever, or they're just, whatever. There are also Protestant churches they're competing with, whatever the history of the particular church may be. And I remember Scientology had a big edifice there too. So there were some new religious groups. But the way in which your life is done. And what he said back to me is, honestly, he said, he reflected, he was very surprised to receive the message. And he said, I never noticed. He said he grew up there and he doesn't even see it. It's invisible to him. To him, it's normal. It's like the boiling frog. It's different. I mean, if you really grow up unreligious or anti-religious, right, what is tolerable to you and what is intolerable is different. This comes back to the absurdity of our notion of tolerance, of course. But I'm telling you, Montreal is not tolerable to me. Montreal is not secular enough for me. Montreal is not atheist enough for me. How do you think I do in Indonesia? How do you think I do in Malaysia? Like, how do you think I would cope with living in more religious countries or contexts? So yeah, it's hard. And certainly it's a good comparison with veganism. The same way non-vegans are blind to the fact that there are advertisements for slaughtered animals around them all the time, often with kind of lurid, disturbing imagery and slogans, right? People who are raised in these religions, they're often blind to, just blind to the evil of religion that is right in front of their face all the time. And they're blind to it because it's in front of their face all the time. Okay, so Sat 12, I don't know anything about this guy. So this isn't someone I've talked to in the past or that I'm not complaining, but there's some people in the audience here where I really know them pretty well. Someone in the audience called Sat 12 says, quote, a vegan world or a one with no religion is a pipe dream at this time. I don't know how old you are. What are you going to do with the next 20 years of your life? We're not talking about pipe dreams. We're talking about practical strategies. Are you going to resign yourself to putting your own son or your own daughter into a Christian school? Are you going to resign yourself to sending your own son or your own daughter to a Christian summer camp? I knew one atheist family that did that when I was in school as a kid. I found it incredibly disturbing. For me, I was a small child, but I really reflected on what it meant to be atheist and reject the church. When my friend Jake was sent off to this, I think it was a Mennonite camp. It was fucking Mennonite. I was like, Jesus Christ. His parents were atheists or nominally atheists. They identified as atheists. They sent their kid to this fucking religious summer camp. So Sat 12, my point here is not that you're wrong. My point is that you're asking the wrong question. The question is, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do now? What's going to be accomplished in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? All right. And to have the attitude that atheism isn't worth fighting for because some kind of idealized utopian end goal is unachievable, it's irrelevant categorically. It's the wrong category of thinking. No, I have a great example I can come back to with Disneyland. Okay. In the year 1965, would Disneyland have made more money or less money if they had embraced Christianity and become an overtly pro-Christian children's entertainment company? They made the hard commitment and they stuck to it that Disney Corporation, all their movies and all their theme parks would have no religion whatsoever. So it's not anti-religious, all right? But you may have never thought of this before. The movie Bambi, the movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, already at that stage, they had made a commitment they were not going to have any Christian morals, okay? And they have these crappy, like, historical recreation villages. They're called like America Town or Americaville and shit. They have these different neighborhoods. Never is there a church in it, okay? They could make a lot of money doing Christian weddings, Christian funerals, whatever. They have Christian services at Disneyland. They could make a lot of money. And back in 1965, think about how religious Americans were. Think about how many people would have shelled out money for the equivalent to Bambi with an explicit Christian parable, an explicit Christian moral of the story. Okay? Being resigned to and conforming to Christian culture is the wrong decision. Rebelling against it, challenging it, producing a new culture to replace it is the right decision. And it's irrelevant to say that we can never live in a world with 0% religion. Okay? That's the wrong answer to the wrong question. Okay? We can never live in a world with zero tooth decay. Get out there and fight to convince people to brush their teeth. Right? It's worth fighting for. We can never live in a world with zero drunk driving. Get out there and fight to get people to commit consciously to never driving drunk. Really brief story. I think I've never told this on YouTube before, but if I have, apologies. I met this woman. I met and talked with a woman for a couple of hours, and she was still dealing with the death of her coworker. She had a male colleague. She was all real messed up about it. And she said that she personally had said to him so many times, why would you risk your life riding your motorcycle drunk, like when you're going home from the nightclub or the bar, when you can just call a taxi cab? And I forget, she said the taxi cab will only cost you $15, whatever number she said. You know, like, this is a life, like, why would you do this? And the guy always said, nah, it's no big deal. Now, I don't know if she said that to him 3 times, or I doubt she said it to him 100 times. But she has said, allegedly, this is something she had actually said to him directly again and again. And one day he got on his motorbike, went home from the pub, and now he's dead. He was killed instantly in a traffic accident that was attributable to his drunkenness, to his state of inebriation or distraction. There will never be 0 drunk driving accidents. If you love someone, if you care about someone, if you respect someone intellectually, fight to save their fucking life. Fight to convince them that a meaningful life requires sobriety. Like, it doesn't just require that you refuse to drink and drive. It requires that you end your drinking. Absolutely. Fight. Because otherwise, if you don't, they may not be here 5 years from now. All right? They may be taken off the census. Yeah. We're dealing with life and death decisions. And of the people who are still going to be alive 5 years from now, right? A lot of them are going to be locked into a meaningless life. A lot of them are going to be, frankly, zombies on this earth. It happens with religion. It happens with drugs. It happens with alcohol. You can live a long life, but one that's meaningless and where the damage done is such that they're never coming back from that. You know? So, in this sense, okay, if you tell me a vegan world is a pipe dream, if you tell me a world with absolutely no religion is a pipe dream, all right, a world without drunk driving is a pipe dream, okay? But that is a completely fallacious reason to give up on the struggle. Even at the smallest scale of just two people face to face, right? Of bringing people over to your model of a meaningful life, which may involve sobriety, it may involve veganism, it may involve atheism. We're presuming all three, right? To bring that one person over to your way of thinking, to give them so that they live rather than die, and so they have a meaningful life rather than a meaningless life. That's worth fighting for, just for your one work colleague, just for your one brother, your one sister, your one son, your one daughter. And it's worth fighting for at the larger scale of a salon of 10 or 15 people. It's worth fighting for at the level of a neighborhood, of a small society of a few hundred, a few thousand people. And it's worth fighting for at the level of millions, you know? So it's interesting, you know, I'm sorry, but Sat 12, you've basically convinced me that you're an imbecile. I don't know how it was possible for you to have such a shallow and stupid response to this. I took the time to to reply to that in depth, but I mean, this is the kind of thing as members of many religions say, you know, them that have ears to hear, let them hear. I mean, I can only do what I can do, and there will be someone in the audience who understands and appreciates the answer I gave to that question. And it's Sat 12. It's not going to be you, but I hope somebody can take that and get motivated, you know, to make a difference. And look, you know, I do think one of the ways in which the world has changed in the 21st century is so many of us don't know people face to face. We know people primarily or entirely over the internet or through messages on mobile phones. You may not know what it's like viscerally to care about someone and respect someone and see intellectual potential in them. And in some sense, to love them, like appreciate them. I don't mean romantic love here, but like you got love for somebody. But they're a drunk, you know, but they get drunk every weekend. Let's say they're a 2-day-a-week drunk. They're sober 5 days a week, but they're risking their life drunk driving. But they have these flaws, you know, and they have that intellectual potential now. Like you think they're smart, you think they have redeeming qualities. If they keep on drinking this way, you know, they may not have that intellectual potential for long. Yeah, maybe because they die, but more likely they just get themselves deep enough into that life as a drug addict, as a kind of brain dead person, as someone leading a thoughtless, stupid existence, that they can't come back, that they can't get out of it anymore. All right, guys. I was going to cap off this video. I think it'll be another video for another day, reading out the whole of my my poems about Socrates. But instead, I'll just describe it. I think it doesn't quite suit the mood as we come to the end of this. You know, I wrote a children's storybook. It's in verse. It's poetry, but it's, you know, it's poetry intended for kids. It's not pretentious grown-up poetry. I started writing stories about Socrates. I started promoting this idea of Socmas, a Socrates-centered holiday to replace Christmas, because in my way, I'm trying to do something positive for the future of the culture, for the future of planet Earth, for the future of my own neighborhood, for the future of my own family. All right. I refuse to keep inculcating into the next generation these myths that I think are barbaric and stupid and wrong. I refuse to inculcate into them values and beliefs that, ultimately I think are dangerous and harmful. All right. I'm not going to keep reproducing the infrastructure of the Christian church or Judaism or Islam, neither in the palpable sense of the institution as it exists in terms of buildings, nor in terms of the more intangible elements of that religious tradition. Now, if you wanted to abolish slavery, you'd have to kill people. We don't talk about the leaders of slave rebellions. We don't talk about the abolitionists as killers, all right? But they were, all right? And you would have to be an outcast living under a false name and a false identity, all right? In this really strange, unexamined way, right? We celebrate the abolition of slavery. We celebrate, the heroism of particular Black people who stood up for civil rights and equality, very carefully selected examples. And we always want to remove the element of violence, the element of risk, the element of self-sacrifice of your life and what it does to you. Slavery was brutal. I remember reading actually a Christian missionary's reflections on slavery. He was a Christian missionary who crusaded against slavery, but at that time, many Christians were pro-slavery, as you can imagine. I remember reading this guy's reflections, and he said, as brutal as the slave masters were to their slaves, if you weren't alive at that time, in that place, in that culture, what you can never realize is that the slave masters themselves were the most brutalized of all. He was saying just like the psychological damage these guys carried around with them. These were men who had committed rape against female slaves from an early age. They were men who'd carried out torture against slaves of various kinds, torture to break their will, torture to force them to obey. They'd been whipping and stabbing people. I remember he described how they always had guns and knives on their person. They could never relax. You could tell who the slave owners were when they sat down in a room, like a bar or restaurant or what have you, the way they sat ready to go. And a lot of them would feel uncomfortable. They'd want to have their knife out. They'd have a knife out on the table, or they'd be whittling something at the table. They were so strung up, the way in which their lives of violence, shaped their minds. And then, of course, you think about these guys. Obviously, these are not the worst victims of the slave system. How did they treat their own children? How did they treat their own wives? The way in which slavery narrows the mind of the slave owner, and the way in which, these slave owners, they slept in the same house, under the same roof, with people they had tortured themselves in the past, people they had whipped, people they had placed in chains, aware that some of these people living in their own house or living, in a shed just behind it, that some of these people would, if they could, take their revenge on slavery. They'd kill them in their sleep, And there are examples from feudalism in Europe too, where it's serfdom rather than slavery that I've read. I remember a vivid description of one guy. He was a feudal estate owner, so he had serfs, not slaves, who at night would lock himself in an iron cage, and his mother was the only person who had the key to the cage. And there were descriptions of how this cage was sort of elevated over a gap in the floor in his own dungeon, kind of thing. So he was locking himself into a dungeon that was probably built for torturing and punishing his own serfs. And instead, he was the one locking himself in at night because he had so many enemies. Some people would like to kill him if if they got the chance. Okay. Slavery brutalized the slaves. Slavery brutalized the slave owners. All right. The people who rose up to tear down the institution of slavery, they were brutalized in their turn. Imagine what psychologically shattered, angry, violent men they were. The people, like, not the storybook version of the Underground Railroad. The people who had blood on their hands from the Underground Railroad. You think they're a nice bunch of guys? Like, compared to cocaine smugglers, think about how tough these people are and the way in which they had to live a lie every day and have multiple identities and so on, right? Think about how they slept at night. What we're talking about here, in saying we have a challenge in front of us. We have a challenge to overcome Christianity once and for all. We have a challenge to stop compromising with Christmas, to stop pretending that we can keep the same box and put new contents inside, to stop pretending that we can keep celebrating American Thanksgiving, and that it's not going to represent genocide. And you would expect that of a family who had been for several generations communists in Russia. You say to them, look, I'm sorry, at some point you have to stop worshiping Joseph Stalin. I know you might think this is harmless. You might think these are traditions you've carried on. You turn to a bunch of neo-Nazis or a continuous family of Nazis and say, look, at some point you have to stop revering Adolf Hitler. And it exists. You can Google around and see it if you want to. That subculture really does exist. And no, you can't just keep the box and change what's inside the box. You have to discard, this ideology, this set of beliefs entirely. It is a challenge. Okay. It's a challenge to ask yourself, how am I going to raise my own daughter without Christmas carols? How am I going to raise my own daughter without reading her the same storybooks that maybe 90% of her classmates are going to have read to her? It's a challenge. What summer camp am I going to send her to? How do I join a gym if the only gym in my town is the YMCA, is a Christian gym? Again, the JCC, the Jewish Community Center, it's a Jewish competitive YMCA. Yeah, you know what? Starting your own gym, it's hard, okay? It's a challenge. Writing your own storybook, making up your own songs, generating something new to challenge the culture that you've inherited from your ancestors, okay? It's hard, but there's nothing brutal about it. Unlike the abolition of slavery, unlike the waves of violence and reprisal, unlike the waves of rebellion and counter-rebellion, revolution and counter-revolution, unlike the internecine conflicts that have taken place even within Protestant Christianity, let alone Protestant versus Catholic Christianity, let alone within Islam, Sunni versus Shiite Islam. Can't we take a positive attitude towards the fact that our struggle, our movement is primarily creative rather than destructive, that we get to fundamentally make our own lives better and make life better just for our own sons, just for our own daughters, maybe for a few of our brothers and sisters, our coworkers, our closest friends. Maybe we can bring some of those people into our orbit, into this life. But we're doing something that only enriches our lives, that only makes our life better. And then there's the potential to make life better for a lot of other people in the short term and in the long-term future of centuries to come. It's that kind of revolution. It's that kind of rebellion. Instead of taking on the lonesome, violent path of living in a slave society and fighting for the abolition of slavery. But step one is that we just have to admit to ourselves as individuals, and as a movement, that what we are fighting for is the abolition of the Christian faith.